The night I realized my husband did not love me, but loved what I owned, was not loud or dramatic, and that was what made it terrifying, because betrayal that whispers instead of screams usually lasts longer and cuts deeper. We were sitting in our penthouse, overlooking the Chicago skyline, the city glowing beneath us like a field of quiet promises, when he casually mentioned numbers that no loving husband should ever calculate. And in that moment, something inside me shifted, because love does not measure, divide, or plan ownership the way he did. My name is Elena, and for most of my life, wealth was something I learned to protect quietly rather than display loudly, because money attracts admiration that often disguises intention, and I had spent years building a life where independence was my greatest luxury. Before marriage, I believed I had chosen carefully. After marriage, I learned how easily performance can be mistaken for sincerity. My husband, Daniel, entered my life as calm confidence wrapped in patience, someone who listened more than he spoke, admired ambition, and never seemed threatened by my success, which was exactly why I trusted him. Because men who feel secure rarely need to prove it. At least that is what I thought. Daniel worked in financial consulting, a career that allowed him to speak fluently about investments, strategy, and long-term planning. And while I admired his intelligence, I did not realize how closely he studied my assets, my properties, my trusts, and the structures my late father had built to ensure I would never be dependent on anyone. My father, Richard Hollowell, had taught me early that love should never require surrender, and that lesson had guided every decision I made until I ignored it for one man who convinced me that partnership meant shared direction rather than shared control. My closest friend, Marissa Cole, warned me gently during our engagement that Daniel asked too many questions about financial timelines and ownership structures, but I dismissed her concerns as overthinking, because when you want to believe someone is different, you interpret curiosity as care. Looking back, I see how careful he was. He never asked directly. He observed. He waited, he listened, he learned. Our wedding was elegant and understated, attended by business associates, family friends, and people who understood discretion, and Daniel played the role of the devoted husband perfectly, attentive without being possessive, proud without being demanding, and supportive in ways that felt refreshing rather than controlling. For the first few months, our marriage felt balanced. We traveled. We hosted dinners. We spoke about future plans with a shared language of growth and stability. Yet beneath that surface, something subtle began to change. Daniel started framing conversations around we in ways that felt strategic, rather than affectionate, discussing how decisions might look legally, how assets could be streamlined, how shared ownership could simplify life, all delivered casually, as though these were natural steps every married couple eventually took. At first, I did not resist. I listened. I nodded. I redirected, because love teaches you to compromise, and I believed compromise was what marriage required. Then came the evening that changed everything. We were reviewing household expenses, when Daniel casually mentioned how fortunate it was that marital law protected both partners equally, especially when one spouse entered the marriage with significantly more assets. And the way he said it was not romantic, or reassuring but analytical, as though he were reviewing a clause, rather than expressing gratitude. He spoke about fairness, about balance, about what he would be entitled to if anything ever went wrong. The room felt colder, not because of his words alone, but because of the confidence behind them. He was not speculating. He was preparing. I smiled politely and changed the subject. But my mind did not let go, because intuition does not shout. It repeats, and once it begins, it does not stop until acknowledged. From that night forward, I started noticing patterns. Daniel encouraged me to restructure certain accounts. He suggested joint signatures. He asked why certain properties remained solely in my name. He framed every question as concern, every suggestion as efficiency, every push as partnership. I did not accuse him. I did not confront him. I observed. And what I observed frightened me, because love does not rush access. Love does not calculate exit strategies. Love does not test boundaries disguised as practicality. I confided in Marissa, who listened quietly before asking one simple question that echoed in my mind for weeks afterward, asking me whether Daniel ever talked about building something together, or whether he only talked about sharing what already existed. That question changed how I heard him. From then on, every conversation felt different. His compliments felt conditional. His affection felt timed. His patience felt strategic. And the most unsettling realization of all was understanding that I had not married a partner, but a player who believed marriage was the final move in a long game. The emotional weight of that realization was crushing, because betrayal inside marriage is not just loss of trust, but loss of identity, as though the version of yourself who believed in love has been quietly replaced by someone forced to think defensively. I began preparing myself emotionally, not for confrontation, but for clarity, because clarity strips power from manipulation, and I needed to see the full picture before deciding my next move. Daniel, sensing my subtle withdrawal, increased his efforts, becoming more attentive, more involved, more persuasive, reinforcing his image as a supportive husband while quietly pushing conversations toward shared assets and legal protections that benefited him far more than they benefited me. He believed I was unaware. He believed affection had softened my boundaries. He believed patience would eventually win. What he did not realize was that I was already stepping back, emotionally and strategically, creating distance not out of fear, but out of resolve. Because once you see someone's true intention, love no longer blinds you. It sharpens you. I did not yet know how the marriage would end. I did not yet know how far he would go, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever game Daniel thought he was playing, I would not be the prize he collected at the end. And the divorce that would eventually end his ambition had already begun. Quietly, the moment I stopped believing his performance and started trusting my instincts again. Once the illusion of safety breaks, nothing ever feels the same again. And even the quietest moments inside a marriage can feel staged when you realize the person beside you is no longer acting out of love but strategy. After that night, I began noticing how carefully Daniel chose his timing, waiting for moments when I was relaxed or emotionally open before steering conversations toward finances, legal protections, and shared responsibility, framing each suggestion as a sign of commitment while subtly testing how much control he could gain without resistance. He never demanded anything directly. He suggested. He implied. He positioned himself as the reasonable one, as the husband simply looking ahead, as someone trying to protect us, both from hypothetical futures that conveniently justified immediate changes in ownership and access. I started keeping mental records of every conversation, every pattern, every repetition, because manipulation relies on subtlety, and once you see repetition, subtlety disappears. Daniel began referencing other couples. We knew, casually mentioning how joint accounts had strengthened their marriages, how shared ownership created trust, how transparency eliminated fear, and each example was presented as wisdom rather than pressure, though the pressure was unmistakable. Once I stopped excusing it, I listened without reacting. I smiled without agreeing. I delayed without refusing, because I needed him to continue, revealing himself, and people reveal the most when they believe they are winning. Marissa became my anchor during this time, offering perspective without panic, reminding me that intuition is not paranoia, when it is supported by pattern, and encouraging me to protect myself emotionally before making any irreversible decisions. She did not tell me what to do. She asked questions that forced me to examine whether Daniel had ever truly invested in building something with me, or whether he had simply inserted himself into what already existed. The answer became clearer every day. Daniel talked endlessly about preserving my wealth, yet he never spoke about contributing to it. He discussed risk but never sacrifice. He mentioned fairness, but only when it benefited him. And the most revealing detail of all was how his tone changed when I redirected conversations away from assets and back toward emotional connection, as though affection without leverage bored him. The emotional distance between us grew quietly, not through fights, but through awareness, and awareness stripped his charm of its effectiveness, leaving behind impatience he struggled to hide. That impatience surfaced one evening, when he asked directly why I seemed hesitant about restructuring accounts, framing my caution as mistrust, implying that reluctance suggested I did not believe in the marriage. And for the first time, his voice carried frustration rather than reassurance. I responded calmly, explaining that independence had always been important to me, that my financial structure existed long before him, and that marriage had not changed my values. And as I spoke, I watched his expression harden just enough to confirm everything I already knew. He was no longer pretending. He was negotiating. From that moment on, the marriage shifted. Daniel became more assertive, less patient, and more openly concerned, with timelines, asking when we might revisit decisions, when I would feel comfortable moving forward. when things would become official, as though marriage itself were incomplete without access to my assets. I felt a strange mix of grief and clarity, because mourning a marriage while still inside it is one of the loneliest experiences a person can endure. Yet clarity brought strength I had not realized I possessed. I began quietly consulting professionals, not because I wanted conflict, but because preparation is the difference between survival and empowerment, and every conversation reinforced what my instincts had already warned me about. Daniel's behavior fit a pattern, a recognizable one, a pattern of someone who entered a marriage with expectations, rather than partnership, who believed emotional investment entitled him to financial reward, and who underestimated the intelligence of the woman he married. What he did not know was that the structures protecting my wealth were deliberate, layered, and designed specifically to prevent exploitation, because my father had seen too many women lose themselves to marriages that treated love as currency. The more Daniel pushed, the more obvious his intentions became, and the less effort he made to disguise them, because entitlement grows impatient when it believes victory is inevitable. He began expressing concern about my independence in ways that framed it as emotional distance, suggesting therapy, shared planning sessions, and financial advisors of his choosing, each proposal designed to move control closer to his hands. I declined politely. I delayed strategically. I documented everything, and in doing so, I allowed him to build the case against himself without realizing it. The final moment of certainty came, when Daniel mentioned divorce, casually during an argument about finances, not as a threat but as a calculation, referencing what he would be entitled to under the law, speaking with the confidence of someone who believed the system would reward his patience. He did not notice how still I became. He did not see how that word shifted something inside me permanently. Because when someone introduces divorce as leverage, they reveal that the marriage is already transactional in their mind. From that point forward, my grief transformed into resolve. I stopped hoping he would change. I stopped searching for excuses. I stopped protecting his image in my mind. Instead, I began planning my exit, with the same precision he had used to plan his entry. Because if marriage was a game to him, then divorce would be the moment. He learned I was never an easy opponent. I remained calm, affectionate even, because emotional detachment is invisible to those who expect control, and Daniel continued believing his patience would pay off, unaware that every move he made was narrowing his options rather than expanding them. The marriage did not collapse suddenly. It tightened, and inside that tightening space, his greed became undeniable, his strategy transparent, and his downfall inevitable. By the end of that chapter of my life, I no longer questioned my worth, my judgment, or my strength. I questioned only how long I would allow him to believe he still had a chance. And the answer to that question would shape the divorce that ended his game completely. The moment I decided the marriage was over did not arrive with anger or tears, but with a strange calm that settled over me one quiet morning as I watched Daniel review documents at the kitchen counter, his focus sharp, his movements precise, and his confidence entirely misplaced, because he still believed the end would favor him. From that day forward, everything I did carried intention rather than emotion, and the shift was subtle enough that he mistook it for acceptance, because people who believe they are winning rarely notice when the rules change beneath their feet. I became agreeable without being compliant, attentive without being vulnerable, and present without being accessible, and Daniel interpreted this change as progress, as evidence that his patience had softened my resistance, unaware that emotional detachment often looks like surrender to those who crave control. He increased his pressure carefully, introducing conversations about long-term planning, suggesting meetings with attorneys, and referencing how divorce laws protected fairness if things ever went wrong. Each comment delivered with rehearsed concern, though his eyes betrayed anticipation rather than fear. What Daniel did not realize was that I had already consulted professionals of my own, individuals who specialized in protecting exactly the kind of financial structure I had built, and each consultation confirmed what I had suspected from the beginning, which was that his expectations were based on assumptions rather than reality. The assets he believed were accessible were not. The wealth he imagined dividing was protected. The outcome he anticipated did not exist. The more confident he became, the more careless he grew, speaking openly about entitlement, framing marriage as contribution, and referencing hypothetical futures, where fairness favored him, all while documenting his own intent without realizing the significance of his words. I allowed him to speak. I allowed him to plan. I allowed him to believe. Because belief was the trap. The final conversation that sealed everything happened on an evening that appeared ordinary, one where Daniel raised the subject of divorce again, this time more directly, outlining what he believed would happen, explaining calmly how the law worked, and suggesting that preparation was wise, because no one enters marriage expecting failure, but everyone should plan for it. He spoke as though he had already won. I listened without interrupting, observing the confidence in his posture, the satisfaction in his tone, and the assumption that his strategy had been flawless. When he finished, I did not argue. I did not accuse. I simply informed him that I agreed, that preparation was wise, and that divorce would indeed be the best course forward. The shock on his face was immediate. Not because I mentioned divorce, but because I did so without emotion, without fear and without negotiation, and in that moment, I saw the first crack. In his composure, the realization that control had shifted. The divorce process moved quickly, not because I rushed it, but because I had prepared long before Daniel realized. The game had ended, and as documents were filed and reality replaced expectation, his confidence unraveled piece by piece. Meetings that he entered with certainty ended in confusion. Conversations he expected to dominate ended in silence. The law he believed would reward him revealed limitations he had ignored. The structures protecting my wealth stood firm. His entitlement met resistance. It could not overcome. What followed was not dramatic confrontation, but public clarity, as legal proceedings exposed the truth of our marriage, revealing intent, pattern, and motivation in ways that stripped Daniel of credibility and control. Friends who had admired him distanced themselves. Associates questioned his narrative. The image he had cultivated as a devoted husband eroded under the weight of documentation and fact. He attempted to renegotiate emotionally, when strategy failed, appealing to memory, affection, and shared history. But those appeals rang hollow once manipulation was exposed, because affection used as leverage loses its power the moment it is recognized. The divorce concluded with precision, not spectacle, and the outcome was decisive. Daniel walked away without access to my wealth, without claim to my assets, and without the future he had so carefully calculated, while I retained everything I had built, protected not just legally but emotionally. The punishment was not poverty or public humiliation, but irrelevance, the realization that his plan had failed completely, and that the woman he believed he could outmaneuver had outgrown him quietly and decisively. When it was over, I did not celebrate loudly. I did not seek validation. I reclaimed my life. The silence that followed was not emptiness, but peace. And in that peace, I understood something essential, which was that revenge does not always require destruction, only clarity, boundaries, and the courage to walk away when someone reveals that they never intended to walk beside you. I left the marriage without regret, without loss, and without the weight of someone else's ambition attached to my identity, knowing that the strongest ending is the one where you keep everything that matters and deny your betrayer the victory they believed was guaranteed. The lesson was simple and permanent. Love does not calculate profit. Marriage does not justify entitlement. And anyone who enters your life, viewing commitment as a transaction, will eventually reveal their price. The question is whether you will pay it, or whether you will walk away and end the game on your own terms. When love becomes a strategy and marriage becomes a calculation, walking away is not failure, but power. If you discovered your partner married you for what you owned rather than who you are, would you confront them immediately, or quietly prepare to leave before they realized the game was over?